In the early morning hours of March 27, 2003, a 4-year-old boy was lying in bed in rural Ohio when he suddenly heard his door open. Now, he assumed it was just his great-grandparents coming in to check on him. And so, he's a kid. He just pretended to be asleep. But he heard whoever this was make their way across the bedroom because he heard the floorboards creaking. And at some point, they were standing right next to his bed. And so, curious, the little boy opened his eyes, and what he saw standing next to his bed was not his great-grandparents. It was a huge green monster. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered-in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button goes on vacation, do them a favor and paint the entire exterior of their house a blinding neon yellow. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of Wednesday, March 26, 2003, a 55-year-old woman named Linda Myers drove down a secluded Tulane road in Darke County, Ohio. Darke County was very rural. It was basically just very small towns and farmland. And so, as Linda drove down the road, kind of in the middle of nowhere, she looked out her window and she saw the sun setting over a field. She was coming home from the pizza shop that she and her husband, Jack, owned in a town nearby. Linda eventually turned down a gravel road and onto the sprawling 40-acre farm where she and her husband lived. She parked outside their old farmhouse, and then she grabbed a deposit bag with money from the pizza shop out of the back seat, and then she got out of her car. Their farm was so isolated that she couldn't hear any cars on the road or anything from the neighbors' houses. So it was completely quiet except for the sheep that were bleating in the field and the occasional sound of power tools coming from the barn. She walked around to the back of the barn and she found Jack hunched over the engine of a beat-up old car. The two of them had been married for about 7 years, and even though this was actually Linda's third marriage, she really felt like Jack was her soulmate. In addition to owning the shop with Linda, the pizza shop, Jack also had a full-time job at a manufacturing plant, and he also had a side business restoring cars. And so, Linda often found him out here behind the barn working on a car around the time the sun was going down. And sitting in the grass beside the car, playing with a wrench, was Linda's 4-year-old great-grandson, Damien. And the second Damien saw Linda. He smiled and he got up and he rushed over to her to give her a big hug. And Damien's smile made Linda feel sort of bittersweet. Damien was the son of Linda's granddaughter, Amber, but Amber had gotten pregnant at just 14 years old and so, as a result, had not been in any position to take care of a baby. So Linda and Jack had offered to take Damien and unraise him for a few years while Amber finished high school and got on her feet. However, this was definitely not a perfect arrangement for many reasons, but one of those reasons was because Damien's father was furious about being cut out of the custody agreement. Even now, for years after, Damien's situation had been decided, the father still argued with Linda about how she wouldn't let him see his son. But Linda felt like, as much as he was saying he wanted to be in Damien's life, she felt like at some point he was going to abandon this child. And so she really didn't want him to be around Damien at all. She didn't want her great-grandson to be abandoned like that. And besides, Damien would have another father figure in his life soon enough because, in the past few years, Amber had finished school, she had met a new man, and gotten married. And as soon as Damien finished up this year at preschool in a couple of months, Amber and her new husband were planning to take him and unraise him on their own. Linda was proud of Amber, how she had turned her life around, but she also felt a little sad, bittersweet, because she and Jack were going to miss having Damien around. They loved him. He was basically their son. Linda knew that Jack clearly was busy with this car and kind of didn't want to be interrupted, so she just said a quick hello and then scooped Damien up and carried him over to the farmhouse. She opened up the door and she sat him down and told him to go wash up before dinner. Then she went into the kitchen and she dropped the deposit bag from the pizza shop into a chair in the dining room. The bag was full of cash, and her plan was to drop it off at the bank in the morning. Linda got out a pan and began cooking dinner, and pretty soon her husband, Jack, came inside covered in car grease. While Jack washed his hands at the kitchen sink, Linda asked him about his day, And Jack kind of grumbled about this customer that he had sold a car to on a payment plan the previous year, who had now missed 3 payments in a row. Jack said he was going to have to drive out there to the person's house tomorrow and repossess the car. Linda could see, Jack is obviously pretty tense here, but Linda knew it wasn't really that missed car payment that was bothering him. The truth was, Jack had been sort of tense really for the past week, ever since he had had this big argument with his 25-year-old son, Greg. Greg had always been very shy and mild-mannered, and really close with his dad. In fact, he was the best man at Jack and Linda's wedding. But recently, Greg's life had been falling off the rails. He was in the middle of a divorce. He was struggling with drinking and drug abuse, and he'd been missing shifts at work. And so, earlier that month, he had come by to ask Jack for money because his house was about to be foreclosed on, and Jack had drawn a line and said no. He told Greg that if he wanted to keep his house, he'd have to clean up his act and get back to work. And so that had led to a very big fight. And so now Linda had a feeling that Jack was genuinely worried that he'd done real damage to his relationship with Greg, perhaps irreparably, because something pretty similar had also happened with Jack's other son, Travis, about 7 years earlier. When Travis was 21, he and Jack had gotten into this big argument that was so bad Travis moved out, and then the two of them had not spoken since for 7 years. So Linda thought Jack must be worried that that would be the same thing that would happen with him and Greg. So while Jack washed his hands, Linda rubbed his shoulders and told him not to worry about Greg. He had a good head on his shoulders and he just needed a little nudge to get back on track. And that's all Jack had done. She reassured him that he'd made the right call and Greg would get through this rough patch sooner or later. Then Linda set the table and called the family to dinner. A little while later, after they'd eaten and cleaned up, Linda looked up at the clock and realized it was getting kind of late. Damien had preschool in the morning and she didn't want him to be tired and grumpy. So she scooped him up and took him to his room upstairs to get ready for bed. She helped him change into his PJs. She brushed his teeth, then tucked him in, gave him a kiss goodnight, then closed the door. Linda went back downstairs, and before long she and Jack were getting ready for bed too. Before long, Linda was in her bedroom. She had turned on a lamp, she had changed into her PJs, and crawled under the covers. And then once Jack was settled in next to her, she turned off the light and they fell asleep. But several hours later, Linda was suddenly woken up by this horribly loud noise, and she sat up and looked around. And when her eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, she gasped. The next morning, at a church a mile away from Lindy and Jack's house, a preschool teacher was getting ready to start class. But she noticed there was an empty chair in her classroom. One of her students, 4-year-old Damien Hoffman, was late. She knew Damien's great-grandparents led busy lives and had several different jobs and businesses, so she figured they must just be running late. So she began class and hoped they would just drop Damien off before he missed too much. And about an hour later at 9 a.m., she was leading the class in morning sing-along-s when Damien suddenly came sprinting into the classroom. Now at first, the teacher was relieved that Damien had shown up, but then she realized Damien looked frazzled and out of breath. And he didn't have his backpack, and he was wearing PJs, and there was a smear of something brown on his shirt. She ran over to him and knelt down next to him, and realized the brown spot was dried blood. The teacher asked Damien what was going on, and he looked at her with a scared, confused expression and he told her his great-grandparents' faces were melting. About 15 minutes later, a police sergeant named Mark Whitaker, along with his partner, drove down a secluded road toward a farmhouse in rural Ohio. Sergeant Whitaker had been a detective for the Darke County Sheriff's Department for 5 years, and he was in charge of the investigative unit. So when the department had gotten a very strange 911 call that morning from a local preschool, he was sent out to investigate. According to the preschool teacher, a 4-year-old student named Damien Hoffman had come into school covered in blood, out of breath, saying something about his great-grandparents' faces being, melting. The teacher identified the great-grandparents as Lindy and Jack Myers. Now, Whitaker had no idea what Damien meant when he had said that their faces were melting, or what kind of situation. Whitaker and his partner would be walking into when they got to the farm, but he had a feeling it would not be good. They pulled up to the farm and parked at the end of the long gravel road, and when Whitaker got out of his car, he immediately noticed how eerily quiet it was. There was another farmhouse just across the road and a few more on the horizon, but otherwise, they were surrounded by empty fields in every direction. Whitaker began walking towards the front door when he saw the front door was already wide open, but there was no clear sign of forced entry. But nonetheless, Whitaker and his partner reflexively drew their weapons in. They stepped inside the house. Whitaker began calling out to see if anybody was home, but there was no response. From where he was standing, he saw there was another open door in the house that led to a set of stairs that went down, presumably to the basement. Whitaker ignored the basement for now and instead continued clearing the first floor. So he went into the kitchen and, once he was sure it was clear, he continued down the hallway until he found a doorway that led into a bedroom. And when he went inside that bedroom, he found Damien's great-grandparents, Jack and Linda Myers, and they were lying in their bed side by side by side by side. And he could tell immediately they were both dead. Now, Jack was actually lying on his stomach, and he could tell right away there was a big bullet wound on the back of Jack's neck. As for Linda, she was on her back, and she had gunshot wounds to her face and her hand, as if she had raised her hand to defend herself before she was shot. And so at this point, Whitaker and his partner did a full search of the house just to make sure nobody else was there, and it was empty. And so the two went back to the bedroom to begin investigating the bodies. Whitaker put on a pair of latex gloves and touched the wound on Linda's face, and the blood was still warm and wet. So he figured likely they'd only been dead for maybe a few hours at most. He looked around the floor and he didn't see any bullet casings, which meant the killer had gone through the trouble of picking them up afterwards to cover their tracks. Then Whitaker's partner called his attention to this weird plastic KY bundle that was lying on a pillow near Jack's head. Whitaker picked it up and he saw it was a piece of quilting fabric that was balled up and covered in masking tape. His best guess was that it was a homemade gun silencer. The killer likely taped it to the end of their gun to muffle the sound of the blast, and it must have blown off at some point when they actually began shooting. Immediately, Whitaker wondered if this was a silencer, why the killer would need one so far out in the middle of nowhere. But when Whitaker left the bedroom and went up a flight of stairs to the room right above where the murders had taken place, he found another bedroom that was full of stuffed animals and toy trucks. It was obviously Damien's room. And it was at this point that Whitaker realized, very likely the killer must have known there was going to be a toddler sleeping right upstairs when they did this. And so they needed the silencer in order to not wake the child when they committed this murder. And so this meant that the killer almost certainly knew Jack and Linda personally. Within minutes, more officers from the Dark County Sheriff's Office swarmed the property. Whitaker went outside to supervise them, and pretty quickly a forensics officer called him over to look at a set of footprints that they had found in the mud. Whitaker followed the trail of footprints around the side of the house to a basement window. The window pane had been pried off, leaving an open hole that was just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Whitaker crouched down and looked through the open space, and he could see inside there was a set of stairs leading up to the main part of the house. And so he realized this must have been how the killer got inside, and it was also why, when they had first gone inside, they had seen the door to the basement standing wide open. And so this only made Whitaker more sure that this crime had to have been committed by somebody close to this couple, because the killer obviously knew the layout of Linda and Jack's house. Whitaker told the forensics officer to make a cast of the footprints so they could figure out what type and size of shoe the killer was wearing. And then, as Whitaker stood back up, he noticed something else. The phone lines that were running along the side of the house had clearly been severed. The killer clearly had planned ahead and made sure that nobody in this house could call for help. Just then, a truck pulled up at the end of the road and a woman got out and started walking toward the house. Whitaker quickly went over to stop her from getting too close to the crime scene, and he asked her what she needed. And she said she was a neighbor who lived at the next property over. She said that she had seen the police cars coming down the road and she didn't really know what was going on, but she felt like she had information that they might want. The neighbor said that around 30 that morning, she'd seen a minivan leaving the Myers farm. It had been so dark that she hadn't been able to see what color it was, but it had stuck out to her because, as far as she knew, the Myers did not own a minivan. And so, hearing this, Whitaker realized, this woman may have seen the killer leaving the property. And if that was true, it meant the murders most likely happened before 4:30 in the morning. And so, this was potentially quite useful. And so he thanked the neighbor, and after she left, he went back inside the house to look for more clues. He really wanted to piece together a motive. He felt strongly that whoever had done this knew Lindy and Jack, but that doesn't mean that the motive is clear. It could be any number of reasons they would attack them. Maybe it was a robbery. Maybe they were just, getting revenge or something. He didn't know. But as he began walking around the house, he found a literal deposit bag full of cash in the living room, which certainly suggested that this was not a robbery, because that would certainly have been taken. And also, there were some pretty expensive electronics in the living room that also had not been touched. So robbery seemed to be out the door. But when Whitaker went back upstairs to take a closer look at the toddler's bedroom, he noticed something odd. There was a little red stain on the bedding that looked like dried blood. While forensic teams were still combing over the farmhouse, another investigator assigned to the case, a guy named Detective Mike Burns, went to the local preschool to speak to 4-year-old Damien. Burns was a father himself, and he felt an immediate connection to this little boy who, at this point, looked scared and very confused. Now, he knew it was going to be very difficult for Damien to rehash something that was so traumatic. But Damien was the only potential witness in the house when his great-grandparents were killed. So, speaking to him was the police's best bet at figuring out what happened. And so Burns sat down on the floor with Damien inside of a private room, and he asked him to explain what had happened that morning. Damien, in a, 4-year-old way, said he'd woken up around 8:45 and the house had been very quiet. So he'd gotten out of bed and went into his great-grandparents' bedroom. And then he said that both of them had been in bed and he thought they were sleeping, but when he tried to wake them up, they wouldn't move them up. And then he realized there was blood on their face, and he said he had tried to wipe the blood off with Kleenex wipes, but there was so much of it that he realized something was very wrong. He thought for a second that their faces were melting. And so, to save his great-grandparents, he had run the full mile down the road to his preschool to get help. Burns was surprised that this 4-year-old could remember and articulate so much about such an awful experience. But he was very grateful because the child's story explained why there was blood on Damien's shirt. However, it did not explain why they'd also found blood on Damien's bed. So he asked Damien if he had gone back into his own room after finding his great-grandparents, but Damien said no. He'd gone straight out the front door and gone to his school. Burns thought there had to be more to the story, though, because otherwise he just couldn't explain how blood wound up in Damien's room. So he brought over a dollhouse and he asked Damien to go ahead and act out everything that had happened the night before using toys to represent himself and his great-grandparents. Damien put the toy that represented himself into bed in one room, and then he put Jack and Linda into the bed in the other room. And he said everybody went to sleep at their normal bedtimes. But later, in the middle of the night, he heard his bedroom door open and he said somebody came inside. Burns asked Damien who it was, and Damien paused him, then he said, "The green monster." At first, Burns wasn't really sure what to make of this. He wondered if Damien was just imagining things or describing a nightmare or something. But then Damien set the toys down and then, to represent the green monster, he used his fingers to crawl across the floor of the dollhouse toward Damien's bed. Damien said he had heard the door open in his room and he had opened his eyes just a little bit. But he didn't want to give away that he was fully awake, so he's just squinting his eyes. And he said when he did that, he saw the green monster right next to his bed, and the green monster was pointing a gun at him. And Damien was so terrified, he said he shut his eyes and just pretended to be asleep. And then he said when he opened his eyes again, the green monster was gone. After hearing this, Burns realized that Damien's recollection was almost certainly not a dream. More likely than not, Damien had come face to face with his grandparents' killer. They were the green monster. After leaving the preschool, the next priority for Detective Burns was to speak to Damien's mother, 19-year-old Amber Holsham. And so the detective drove out to Amber's house, which was in a nearby town, and when he rang the doorbell, she answered right away. Now, at this point, nobody in the family had been notified yet about the murders, so Amber seemed to have no idea why a detective was now standing on her doorstep. Now Burns knew this, and so he said to her, "Can I please come inside? We need to speak." And so, confused, Amber said okay, and she let him inside and they sat down in the living room. And then Burns said to her, very gently, that her grandparents, Lindy and Jack Myers, were no longer with them. But when Amber heard this, she just looked confused and asked what he meant, like, where are they? So Burns took a deep breath and he clarified that they were deceased. Amber looked completely shocked and immediately asked, "Is Damien dead, Toro?" But Burns said no, he's alive. But he's going to be kept in protective custody for a while in case whoever killed Jack and Linda tried to hurt him too. And until they narrow down the suspects, Damien would not be allowed to see anybody in the family, including her, his own mother. At this point, Amber just began to cry. Burns felt horrible for her, but really he was thinking about Damien. He knew he had to solve this case as quickly as possible, because every day that he didn't would be another day that Damien would have to spend alone without any family to comfort him. Based both on Amber's reaction to the news and the fact that Damien did not mention seeing his mother on the night of the murder, Burns thought it was highly unlikely that Amber was a suspect. But she could know something that might help the investigation. So once she calmed down, Burns asked her if she knew anyone who might have wanted to hurt her grandparents. Right away she nodded and she mentioned Damien's father, Andrew Huffman. She said Andrew hated Linda because she wouldn't let him see Damien. In fact, just recently, Andrew had come to Linda's pizza shop and started a fight with her about custody, and it had escalated to the point where Andrew had publicly threatened to kill her. This obviously caught Burns' attention because it made perfect sense as a motive. If Linda and Jack were out of the way, well, Andrew would have an easier time getting custody of Damien. And so he thanked Amber and promised he would be in touch soon. And then, as soon as he was back in his car, he called Sergeant Whitaker and he told him what he'd learned. Later that day, Whitaker and his partner made the 2-hour drive to Andrew's address in Newport, Kentucky. When they got there, Andrew quickly came to the door and he let them inside. And they sat down and Andrew looked at them like, "What's going on?" And they told him that Lindy and Jack had been murdered, and they watched Andrew for his reaction. And he seemed very surprised, but he definitely did not seem upset. Andrew would then admit that he did not get along with Amber's family. And when Whitaker asked him about that big argument at the pizza shop, Andrew did not deny that he had literally threatened to kill Linda. But he swore he would never actually do it. He said it was just an empty threat he made in the heat of the moment. Still, Whitaker thought Andrew looked very suspicious, so he asked him for an alibi. And Andrew said he'd stayed over at a girl's house on the night of the murder. And in the morning he'd stopped by his dad's house and then gone straight to work. And you could ask all those people, and that's where he was to where he was at. Whitaker wrote all this down and then asked Andrew a few more questions, and then thanked him for his time. And then, as soon as the detectives left, they immediately went to go check on Andrew's alibi. They went to that girl's house, then they went to Andrew's dad's house, and then they also went to his place of work. And everybody at those 3 locations all confirmed Andrew's alibi. So unless someone was lying, it left no window of time where Andrew could have driven 2 hours away to Ohio to murder Jack and Linda. Whitaker was disappointed that they basically wasted most of the day on this lead that now looked like it wouldn't go anywhere, especially knowing that, again, every moment in this case that it went unsolved was another moment that Damien would have to spend away from his family all alone. The following morning, Detective Burns, the same officer who had spoken to Damien and also his mother, Amber, sat inside of his office feeling very frustrated. He had one goal for the day. He wanted to interview Jack's estranged son, 28-year-old Travis Myers. But it was looking like that was going to be harder than he had anticipated. So the day before, A bunch of sheriff's deputies had interviewed Lindy and Jack's family and friends. And family members in particular had mentioned that Travis and Jack had some bad blood. And when Burns had dug through the files on Travis, he found out that Travis also had a criminal record. But there was a problem. It appeared that Travis hadn't even been in Ohio in 7 years. The last anybody in the family had heard, he'd moved to Arizona to live with his mother. But when Burns had called the mother that morning, she said that she actually didn't know where Travis was at all, and there was no other address on record for Travis. So Burns basically had no idea where he was. And so he began to wonder, how was he gonna track Travis down? And he decided he should start by visiting Travis's younger brother and Jack's other son, whose name was Greg. Burns knew Greg lived only a few towns over, and even though he really wasn't sure how close the brothers might be, it was the only lead he really had. A little while later, Burns showed up at Greg's house and he knocked on the front door. And a moment later, a young man in a baseball cap answered, and he looked very much like he'd been crying. Burns asked if he was Greg Myers, and the young man nodded and stepped aside to let him in. Greg did not seem remotely surprised by this visit. He said the police had already contacted him the night before to tell him about his father and stepmother's murder, and since then, he said he'd just been waiting for somebody to come by and talk to him because he'd seen enough TV to know that family members were always the first suspects. But when they got into the living room, Burns stopped in his tracks because there was another young man standing in the doorway and he looked a lot like Greg. Burns asked who it was, and Greg said, "Oh, that's my brother Travis." Burns couldn't believe his luck. He'd come here hoping to figure out where Travis might be, but he never imagined he would just find Travis standing in Greg's house. And this was a big development because, really, until now Burns had no idea if Travis was even in the state at the time of the murders. But Greg would actually tell him that Travis had been in Ohio for the past several weeks, staying in an apartment that he had rented right nearby. Burns did think the timing seemed very suspicious. It just seemed way too convenient that Travis had come back into town for the first time in almost a decade right before Jack and Linda were killed. It just seemed perfect. And also at this point, it just seemed really suspicious that these two brothers are just standing here waiting for police to come question them. It just... Something felt off. So Burns, operating on a gut instinct, told them both that in order to question them, they actually had to come with him to the station and do it formally down there. Less than an hour later, Detective Burns opened the door of the Dark County Sheriff's Office and he showed Greg and Travis Myers inside. Now, neither of the brothers were under arrest yet, but Burns had a feeling that by the end of their interviews, one or both of them could be. Burns took Greg into his office for questioning, while Burns' partner took Travis into a room down the hall. As soon as Greg sat down in front of the desk, Burns noticed that he wasn't making eye contact with him. He was sort of acting shifty, but pretty quickly, Greg said he was perfectly willing to tell the detectives anything they wanted if it could help solve his dad and stepmother's murders. And so Burns immediately began asking questions. He asked Greg what he was doing in the early hours of Thursday morning when Jack and Linda were ill. And Greg told him that, mostly, he was just asleep. That is until about 4:30, when he got up to go to his job at a factory that was a few towns over. He also said his girlfriend was at home with him the whole night and she could confirm that. He then said he drove to work in his minivan and he clocked in at 5. He even had a signed time card back home that would prove it. And Burns was immediately very interested to learn that Greg drove a minivan because remember, that neighbor had said she saw a minivan leaving the Myers farm around 4:30 on the morning of the murders, suggesting the killer drove a minivan. However, Burns was starting to realize that even if Greg's alibi were shaky or didn't check out, the timing alone likely ruled him out. It basically was impossible to drive from Greg's house at 4. He left, go all the way to the farm, commit the murders, then drive to the factory and be able to clock in at 5:0 a.m. when he had his time card stamped. That just wasn't enough time to do all that. And also, pretty much everybody in the family had told Burns that Greg was quite close with Jack and Linda. Now, he was having some problems with drugs and alcohol, but He had no history of crime or violence, and none of his family members thought he seemed capable of being a killer. So even though Greg remained a suspect, Burns decided he would shift his focus to Travis. So Burns asked Greg how had Travis reacted when he heard about Jack and Linda's murders. And he said Travis had been upset, but he'd mostly been concerned about how Greg was coping, because Greg was the one who was much closer to Jack and Linda. You know, Travis was estranged. Greg went on to say that it had been at least 7 years since Travis and his father had spoken, and that those two did not get along at all. Burns asked Greg about that falling out between Jack and Travis, and Greg said it just came down to business disagreements on the farm. He said Travis had felt like his father was cheating him out of money, and they had this big argument that got really ugly. So Travis had just quit the business and moved away. Burns thought about this and he wondered if maybe Travis stood to inherit any money if his father died, because if so or died, that would definitely be a solid motive for murder. And so Burns made 2 mental notes. One was to look into Greg's alibi, and the other was to look into Jack's will to see how his assets were going to be divided up. After that, he thanked Greg for his cooperation, told him to wait in his office, and then Burns left and he went right down the hall and he waited outside the door while his partner finished questioning Travis. Burns' partner would say that Travis had seemed really nervous from the very moment he stepped inside the room. The detective had asked him what he was doing in Ohio, and Travis said he'd just been reevaluating his life recently and he'd realized that he'd never actually met his brother Greg's children. So he'd come back to Ohio to do just that and spend some time with them. Then the detective asked him what he was doing when Jack and Linda were killed, and Travis stuttered out that he was sleeping in his apartment. The detective asked him if he had anybody who could confirm that, and Travis kind of hesitated and then shook his head and said no. Then the detective asked Travis if he had a car, and Travis said that, at the moment, he was driving his mother's car, a white minivan. After getting debriefed by his partner about this interview with Travis, Burns went back into his office. By this point, Greg had been moved out and put in a different room, and Burns sat down at his desk and he began going over the evidence they had collected so far. Now, the investigation to this point had been moving really quickly, and so there actually wasn't a whole lot of evidence yet. In fact, it had only been 24 hours since the forensics were sent to the crime lab, so they were still waiting for results on pretty much everything. Burns knew that, at this point, the best thing he could do while he waited for more evidence was go follow up on Travis and Greg's alibis. After all, they are the victims' children, and he already thought that the killer had to be connected personally to the victims. And they both drove minivans, so really, either of them could be the killer. But just then, Burns' phone rang. He picked it up and it was a local man who said he had seen a news report about Jack and Linda's murders, and he had some information that just might help. The man said that a few days earlier, his friend had called him to see if he knew where they could buy a gun. And when this man who's talking to Burns, asked this friend why they needed the gun, the friend said it was because they, quote, wanted to shoot Jack Myers. The man told Burns the name of his friend who said this. And as soon as Burns heard that name, he knew exactly who his murderer was. Based on this phone call, as well as forensic evidence from the crime scene, this is what police believe happened to Jack and Linda Myers on the morning of March 27th, 2003. Early on the morning of the murders, the killer woke up and got out of bed, and right away put on a green hunting jumpsuit. And they also packed a bag with duct tape, trash bags, and a roll of masking tape. Then they put on a pair of latex gloves and loaded the 12-gauge shotgun that they had purchased from a classified ad 2 days earlier, and they carried all their supplies out to their minivan. After they were ready, they hopped in the driver's seat, turned on the car, and then drove a familiar route through the dark, open fields. They were calm at first until they turned onto the gravel road that led to Jack and Linda's farm. At that point, their heart began to race. Now, the killer felt like they had planned all of this out and prepared for anything that could go wrong. So now, really, all they had to do was just control themselves and just stick to the plan. So the killer parked right outside the farmhouse, and then while staying in the car, they climbed into the back seat of the minivan and they grabbed their shotgun. Then they grabbed this thick quilting fabric and they wrapped it around the barrel of the shotgun, and they used masking tape to secure it. That was their DIY silencer. But as they went through this plan, the killer's hands were shaking. They were nervous, because as much as they had planned for this, it really was not something they actually wanted to do, but they felt like they had to. So after their gun had its silencer on it, they slung it over their shoulder. Then they got out of the van and crept around to the side of the house. And once they were there, they cut the phone lines so nobody inside would be able to call for help. Then they knelt down in the dirt and they pried open the basement window and they climbed inside. Once inside, the killer walked to the stairs. They went up to the first floor, and they walked straight to the bedroom where they knew Jack and Linda would be asleep. They went inside and there they were, sleeping in their beds. And the killer took a deep breath and then raised their shotgun. They fired a single round into the back of Jack's neck, but the force of the gunshot had blasted off the homemade silencer, and so, basically, it wasn't silent at all. It was extremely loud. And that homemade silencer landed on the pillow right next to Jack's head. And almost immediately from the chaos, Linda sat up and she looked straight at the killer and she saw what was happening. And she just raised a hand to try to defend herself. And in a moment of panic, the killer just turned the shotgun on her and they fired twice. And one blast went through her hand, and the other struck her right in the face. At this point, the killer just paused and waited. The silencer had sort of muffled the first shot, but the second two were so loud they knew that noise easily could have woken up the third person who they knew was in this house, someone they really didn't want to hurt. But if they had to, they would. So just to make sure they didn't have any loose ends, they left Lindy in Jack's bedroom, confident they were dead, and they crept upstairs to little Damien's room, and they went inside and they carefully walked over right next to the boy's bed, and they raised their shotgun and aimed it at this child, waiting to see if they were awake. But the little boy appeared to be asleep, and so the killer spared him. They lowered their shotgun and they walked out of the room. Once they were out in the hallway, they shut Damien's door and then hurried right out of the house. And from there, they got back in their minivan and they sped off. A few miles away, they stopped on a bridge and tossed their gun, their supplies, and their clothes into a river. And then they changed into their work clothes and they drove to the factory where they would clock in at precisely 5:00 a.m. The killer was Jack's younger son, Greg Myers. Greg had been having problems with money and drug abuse, and his father, Jack, had refused to help him and they were fighting about it. But Greg knew he would inherit the farm if his father died, and he was so desperate, he decided murder was his best option. When police timed the drive from Jack and Linda's farm to Greg's workplace, they found that he would have actually had just enough time to commit the horrible double murder and then doctor straight to work and clock in by 5:23. Greg was ultimately arrested about 48 hours after the crime, so quickly that police were actually still gathering evidence to use against him. They later found the gun, other supplies, and shoes that matched the prints found outside the house in a river right near the farm. And fingerprints and receipts tied all the items back to Greg. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. As for Damien, following the murders, he would go to live with his mother, Amber. Despite everything he witnessed at just 4 years old, Amber said in a 2021 documentary that he is now doing very well. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bowen. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Era. Audio, editing, and post-produced by Whitlock Asio and Collock Asio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Mann and Ian Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clugston Kino. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. In December of 2005, a young woman walked down a sidewalk in New York City. There were Christmas decorations on all the buildings and Christmas lights. I mean, it was very festive. But As she walked along, she glanced over at a newspaper stand and she saw something on the front page of that paper that literally made her stop in her tracks. And not because it was festive, it was awful. Right there on the front page was a picture of the one thing in her life that she'd hoped she would never, ever see again. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, on the next extremely hot day, sneak into the follow button's house and jack their thermostat all the way up to the highest possible setting. Then, go ahead and just rip the thermostat out of the wall and then leave. Okay, let's get into today's story. Early on the evening of Sunday, November 27, 2005, a 21-year-old woman named Catherine would lean towards the mirror to put on her eyeliner inside the bathroom of her small apartment in New York City. Catherine's phone was sitting on the bathroom counter and she heard it buzz, but she didn't even look to see who was calling. She didn't have time to talk to anyone because she had to finish getting ready for her 7:00 shift at work. So, Catherine had moved to New York City from Ohio 3 years earlier to pursue her dream of becoming a dancer on Broadway. But everything here was so expensive that, in addition to chasing her dream, she also had to work 3 different jobs just to make ends meet. Now, 2 of those jobs were pretty standard. She worked as a waitress and also taught children's dance classes. But tonight, she was getting ready to go to her 3rd job, and this job was not really standard at all. In fact, to her, she was sort of embarrassed about it, and because of that, she was keeping it a secret from almost everybody in her life. Her 3rd job was working as a topless dancer at a strip club near Times Square called Flash Dancers. Catherine honestly hated the work, but it paid really well, and if she wanted to have her shot at Broadway, she needed to pay for voice lessons and dance classes. Now, she did live in Manhattan, which was the most expensive part of the already very expensive city, and she knew that she could save some money if she just moved to a neighborhood where rent was cheaper. But when she had first moved to New York, she had lived in a less expensive neighborhood for that reason, and unfortunately, her landlord had sexually assaulted her. The experience had been so traumatic that Catherine had, at the time, considered just leaving New York and going back to Ohio and just being done with this place. But in the end, she had decided to stay in New York and continue chasing her dream. Now, she did move within New York. She got in this apartment in Manhattan because it was a lot safer. And she also got a roommate to help with the cost. His name was David Hahn. He was 23 and he was one of Catherine's friends from back home in Ohio. But at this very moment, David was not inside the apartment. He'd gone outside to get his car so he could doctor Catherine to work. Catherine finished her makeup and left the bathroom, and as she walked through the living room, she stepped over a black dog that was sleeping on the floor. The dog was not Catherine's, and it actually was not David's either. David was a part-time dog sitter, so this dog was just staying with them while its owners were out of town. Just like Catherine, David also had a bunch of part-time jobs to help make ends meet. When he wasn't dog sitting, he worked as a doorman at a hotel just up the street from their apartment. Now, Catherine and David had actually been romantic at one point. They had dated for a little while, but these days they were just roommates living together to split the bills. Although secretly Catherine did sometimes wonder if, maybe they should give it another shot to try being a couple again. Thanksgiving had been a few days ago, and instead of going home to Ohio like she usually did, Catherine had stayed in New York and celebrated with David. And it had been a really nice time. Plus, David knew about Catherine's 3rd job of working at Flash Dancers, and he didn't judge her for it, and Catherine felt like a lot of people did. So, she liked that about him. But the biggest hurdle that Catherine could see to potentially rekindling their relationship was the fact that David disliked basically every man she met. Whether she was dating them or not, he just did not like them. Now, some of these guys she could understand why David, didn't like them. Like there was this guy, Joe, that she had dated briefly who she had only met because he was a patron of her strip club. But then there were people like Paul, who was a personal trainer at Catherine's gym, who she had only seen off and on and who was nothing but nice to David. And even though Paul and Catherine were not dating now and mostly just spoke on the phone periodically, David still insisted that Paul was a creep. He just did not like the guy. But for now, Catherine figured, you know what? I'm not going to figure out my entire romantic life. I just need to finish getting ready and go downstairs so she wouldn't keep David waiting. So Catherine went into her bedroom and began getting dressed, and that's when she heard that dog start barking at something in the living room. And so, curious, Catherine walked in that direction to see what was going on. A little while later, Catherine's roommate David walked quickly along the sidewalk to get his car, which was parked ways up the street. He was out of breath by the time he reached it. He knew he had to hurry, so he jumped in and he drove back to the apartment building, and he called Catherine as he pulled up out front. When she didn't answer, he threw on his hazards and he climbed back out to go into the building to go get her. And he had just made it up the flight of stairs that led to his second-floor apartment, and he was going down the hallway when he saw something that made him come to an abrupt stop. It was that black dog that he was dog-sitting. Somehow it had gotten out of the apartment and was just standing there in the shared hallway outside of his apartment door. David blinked and then realized that his neighbor, a man he rarely interacted with named Brad Stewart, was standing right behind the dog. And Brad was holding a leash that was clearly clipped onto the dog's collar. For a second, Brad looked surprised, and David was just completely confused about why this guy had the dog that he was dog-sitting on a leash. But then Brad told David that he had found the dog wandering around, recognized it as David's, and brought it back to his apartment. Brad said he had just knocked on David's apartment door, but so far nobody had answered. So at this point, David understood, why Brad has the dog, but he didn't know why the dog was out of the apartment in the first place. But he kept that to himself and just thanked Brad, took the leash, and then stepped over to the door of his apartment, numbered to D. The apartment door was shut, but when he turned the handle, he found that it was unlocked. David couldn't remember if he had left it unlocked or not, so he just opened it, and he called out Catherine's name. But there was no answer, which was weird, so he stepped inside. Now, he didn't see Catherine, but he did see the door to her bedroom was slightly cracked open. So he walked over to it and he called out to her again, and then when she didn't call back, he tried pushing her door open. But the door didn't really open. It instead swung maybe a few inches and then stopped, and David felt resistance on the other side, like something maybe on the ground was holding the door from opening all the way. And so now, with all these strange things happening, David started to feel pretty worried. And so a surge of adrenaline came over him, and he just shoved the door open and he stuck his head in and he looked inside. And when he saw what was in there, he immediately pulled back, turned around, ran into the hallway, and he called the police. A half an hour later, around 7:30 p.m., an NYPD detective named Steven gets walked up a flight of stairs at an apartment building in Manhattan. This part of the city was known to be extremely safe. Homicides never really happened here. But if the 911 caller had been telling the truth, Getz knew that a potential grisly murder scene was, in fact, waiting for him in apartment to D. When he reached the second-floor landing, he saw there were already a few other NYPD officers on the scene, and one of them was speaking to this young, skinny guy standing in the hallway who looked really upset, and he was holding a leash that was connected to a black dog. Another officer walked over to Getz and filled him in. He said the man that was being spoken to was the victim's roommate, David Hahn, and he was the one who had found the body and called 911. The victim, Catherine Woods, was inside the apartment in the back bedroom. Getz nodded and then walked down the hallway past David and the dog toward the apartment door. His plan was to look at the scene himself before he began questioning anyone. Getz put on some disposable rubber gloves and checked out the door frame to the actual apartment. And then he also looked at the door itself, but he didn't see any damage that could signify first entry. So he stepped into the apartment and he saw that the small living room was a little bit messy, but it wasn't like it had been ransacked or something. The futon was pulled out and there were some men's clothes strewn around, but it sort of looked like a typical place that people live. And so Getz walked through the living room, being careful not to disturb anything, and he went towards what he assumed was the bedroom where the body was of. The door was open just wide enough that Getz was able to get through, and when he stepped through and was inside the room, he saw blood everywhere. It was all over the walls and the furniture, and the room itself looked like it had been completely torn apart. One of the dresser drawers was open, and lots of women's clothing was scattered all over the place. And the mattress had been completely taken off the bed frame and was now lying on the floor. And that's actually what was blocking the door from opening all the way. And then, in the middle of the room, in a pool of blood, lay the body of a young woman. Getz knew from the 911 call that her name was Catherine Woods. He walked over and squatted down next to her for a closer look. She was wearing a t-shirt and underwear, and the t-shirt had a very obvious shoe print on it, like whoever had killed Catherine had stepped on her. And there were at least a dozen stab wounds all over her body. There were also what appeared to be defensive wounds on her hands and arms, which Getz knew meant she must have fought back against her attacker. But the worst injuries she sustained were definitely to her neck. Whoever had killed her had slit her throat so deeply that they had almost decapitated her. And so to get right away. It seemed like whoever killed Catherine had been in an absolute rage. At that point, Getz heard footsteps coming from behind him, and he stood up and he turned around to see that the NYPD forensics team had arrived. Now, the block door was making maneuvering in and out of this bedroom pretty difficult. So one of the first things the forensics team did was to pick up the mattress and carefully lean it against the wall, so the bedroom door could now swing open all the way. Then, Detective Getz just stepped back and let the forensics team get to work. He watched as they pulled the shoe print off the t-shirt Catherine was wearing, and then also, there was a second, identical shoe print that was on her bed sheets that they also grabbed. To Getz, both of these prints did appear to be from the exact same shoe. And to the naked eye, these prints appeared, at least to Getz, to belong to very likely an average-sized man. Detective Getz was immediately curious about something, so he stepped out of the bedroom into the living room, and he quickly found a couple pairs of men's shoes lying on the floor. And although the tread of these shoes did not match the prints he had just seen in the bedroom, they did appear to be the exact same size. An hour later, at about 8:30 p.m. on November 27, 2005, Detective Getz sat down at a table inside of an interview room at the NYPD's 19th precinct. And once he did, he handed a bottle of water across the table to David Hahn, the roommate of the murder victim and Detective Getz's current #1 suspect. There had been no sign of forced entry at the apartment that David and Catherine shared, which meant that Catherine's killer either had access to the apartment or was let inside by somebody who did. And the murderer had been committed with a knife in a really savage way that struck Getz as being a personally motivated attack. Even though Catherine's bedroom had been trashed, nothing seemed to have been stolen. And because Catherine had been found partially undressed, there was potentially a sexual motive at play as well. So, Getz's working theory here was that this murder was committed by a man who knew the victim well and had easy access to her living space. And David fit that profile to a T. Plus, he apparently wore the same size shoe as the killer. Although as Detective Getz settled into his chair and brought out his notepad, he did a quick scan of David's forearms and his hands, and he saw that David had no visible cuts, scrapes, or bruises. The detective thought that Catherine's killer likely would have some injuries there because she had obviously been fighting for her life. She would have left a mark on them. But Getz didn't say anything about this to David. Instead, he just leaned forward and he asked David to walk him through what had happened that day. David's hands were shaking a bit, but he took a deep breath to calm himself, and he said that he had been at the apartment with Catherine that night until about 6:40 p.m. That was when he had left to go get his car so he could come back and Dr. Catherine to her 7:00 shift that flashed answers. But he said retrieving his car had taken longer than he expected because, on the way, he had run into some of his co-workers from his doorman job and he had stopped to chat with them. He said after he had done that and he had gotten his car and he went back to the apartment. He had expected Catherine to be waiting outside by the curb. But when he got there, there was no sign of her, and she didn't answer when he called her. So David said he'd ultimately gone inside and ran upstairs to the apartment, and in the hallway, he had found his neighbor, Brad, who was oddly holding the leash of the black dog that David was supposed to be looking after. And then David said he went into his apartment, and that's when he found Catherine's body. David said he had called 911 right away. It was right around 7:00 p.m. And at this, Getz stopped writing on the notepad and just looked up at David. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. David was claiming that he'd only been out of the apartment for 20 minutes, and that in that narrow window of time, Catherine had been brutally murdered and the killer had also escaped. It honestly sounded like one of the worst alibis Getz had ever heard. But he didn't want David to know just how close he was to getting arrested for murder, because he didn't want David to get scared and stop talking. So Getz kept his tone very sympathetic as he asked how long David had known Catherine for. David said they had met back in Ohio a few years ago while Catherine was visiting her hometown. They'd begun dating and he had ultimately moved out to New York to live with her. But it wasn't long before Catherine broke up with him and then asked him to move out. But David said he had not been able to afford his own place, so he had started sleeping in his car, and Catherine had felt bad about that. So she had ultimately let him move back in on the condition that he slept on the futon out in the living room. By now, Detective Getz's pen was flying across the page because David was not just Catherine's roommate. He was her ex-boyfriend. An ex-boyfriend who was the last person to see Catherine alive and discovered her body. Getz was more confident than ever that he was sitting across from Catherine's killer. He told David that everything he was saying was incredibly helpful, but by now he needed to go check on something. David agreed to wait and Getz stood up to leave, but he stopped at the door and he asked David for one last thing before he left. He asked what his shoe size was, and without missing a beat, David answered that he wore a 10.5. Getz jotted this down and then he left. What he hadn't told David was the reason he was stepping out of the room was to go get some information from the NYPD's forensics team in the uniform, officers who were currently questioning David's neighbors. And once Getz had that information, he was going to use it to try to catch David in a lie. About 19 hours later, so about 3:00 p.m. the next day, Getz was sitting at his desk feeling completely exhausted, but was pounding yet another cup of coffee. He'd been up all night interrogating David, who was still literally sitting right down the hall in the interrogation room. And also Getz had been going back and forth with the forensics team and other officers and detectives who were out in the neighborhood. And he still had loads more to do before he could finally go to sleep. Right now, Getz was going over a new batch of reports from the uniformed officers who had gone door to door in Catherine and David's apartment building, asking the neighbors if they'd seen or heard anything unusual. And just like Getz had hoped, the information they were getting did contradict pieces of David's story. David claimed that he had left the apartment at about 6:40 p.m. and said that at that time Catherine was fine. But two neighbors said they heard screams coming from the apartment before 6:40 p.m. The man in the unit directly above David and Catherine said he had heard 3 screams at 6:28 p.m. And the people in the unit next door to David and Catherine said they'd heard screaming, barking, and the sound of furniture moving around even earlier, between 5:45 and 6:00 p.m. Now, none of these neighbors had done anything about these noises because the noises had stopped pretty quickly. And then there was Brad Stewart, the neighbor who had said he had found the black dog. Brad told police that when he ran into David in the hallway, it was sometime between 6:00 and 6:30. But David had said that he went back up to the apartment and found Catherine's body at about 7:00 p.m., a full half hour later. Now, Getz knew witnesses were often bad with time, and in a dense New York City apartment building, there were lots of noises coming from lots of units. But still, it looked to him like David's alibi had serious problems. And so the detective sat back and had some more coffee, and then his phone rang. He picked it up and it was the forensics team with an update about those shoe prints that were on Catherine's shirt and the bed sheets. And the prints were indeed left behind by a roughly average-sized man. They were a men's size 10.5, and this was the exact size Getz knew David wore. Getz thanked them, hung up the phone, and then rushed back to the interrogation room to have yet another chat with David Hahn. This time, though, Getz did not offer David water. He just sat down and he confronted him with all these new facts. He told David that the killer's shoe prints were exactly his shoe size, that his neighbors had heard screams before David had supposedly left the building, and that Brad said he'd seen David in the hallway at least a half an hour earlier than David had claimed he was there. Getz leaned in and told David that there were also security cameras in the apartment building and his officers were already in the process of getting access to that footage. So if David had anything to say, he better say it now. Gets watched as David's expression went from exhausted to clearly afraid. It seemed like this might be the first time that David realized the police truly did not believe his story. And after a second of just stunned silence, David insisted that he had not killed Catherine and he begged Getz to believe him. But when Getz just glared back at him completely unmoved, David launched into a whole new story, one he had not mentioned at all over the last 20 hours of interrogation. David said Catherine knew this guy named Paul Cortez. She had dated him, but David had always thought he was kind of a creep. And David said Catherine had told him that Paul was obsessed with her. So David said the police really ought to go investigate Paul, not him. To Getz, this seemed like a desperate, last-minute attempt to cast suspicion on somebody else. But he knew he did have to follow every lead, so he did write down Paul's name and told David they'd look into it. When Getz finally left the station for the evening, David was still in the interrogation room and reporters from all the daily papers were beginning to assemble right outside. The following morning, the story of Catherine's murder and pictures of her smiling face were all over the news. The front page of the New York Daily News carried a headline that made Getz grimace. It read, "Secret Life of Slain Stripper." Inside, the article reported that Catherine's family hadn't known she was working as a topless dancer until they literally flew to the city from Ohio to collect her body. Getz skimmed the article at his desk. He wasn't convinced that Catherine's line of work had anything to do with her murder, but the papers seemed intent on running with it, and a media circus was like the last thing Getz wanted. His team was already under enough pressure to make an arrest as it was, and it was going to be even harder to do their jobs now that a bunch of tips were going to be flooding in from the public from all this media. Getz put down the newspaper, got up from his desk, and walked down the hall to the interrogation room. He'd finished the day yesterday feeling pretty confident that David was his murderer. So when he'd sent David home, he had given him instructions not to leave the city because he intended to arrest David soon. But first, Getz did need to follow up on the other leads he had to hopefully rule them out. And one of those leads was sitting in the interrogation room right now waiting for him. It was Paul Cortez, the man that David had named, who officers had tracked down and brought in, the man who supposedly was obsessed with Catherine. As soon as Getz entered the room, the first thing he did was look at Paul's shoes, and he could see that they were a pretty typical size. Two was, at a glance, they looked like they could also be a 10.5. Getz also looked for scratches or bruises on Paul's skin, in particular on his forearms and his hands, and he did see one. There was a small injury on one of Paul's fingertips. Getz asked about it, and Paul said his finger had just got unpinched between a couple of weights at the gym. Paul was very calm and soft-spoken, and he said he'd heard all about Catherine's death in the papers and he just wanted to help if he could help if he could. When Getz told him that they'd gotten his name from David Hahn, Paul just kind of rolled his eyes and said, "You know, David had always been jealous of his relationship with Catherine." Paul explained that he had met Catherine at the gym about a year ago and they'd been dating off and on ever since. At the time of Catherine's death, he said they had been off, but Paul said he still cared about her and had hoped that maybe one day they might get back together. Paul told Getz that he hadn't actually seen Catherine on the day of her death, but that he had actually spoken to her on the phone earlier that afternoon, which was not unusual. The two did speak on the phone from time to time. That's all it was yours. Paul said he actually had tried calling her a second time that day, but she didn't answer. But Paul said he really didn't think much of it. And then Paul said that night he wound up going shopping with some friends, and then also to a local bar to watch the Jets game at about 8:30. Getz made a note to follow up on Paul's alibi. Then he asked Paul if he had any idea who might have killed Catherine. Paul thought for a moment, and then his eyes lit up, and he said there had been some stalker guy named Joe who'd been one of Catherine's regulars at the strip club. You know, months ago he'd somehow gotten Catherine's phone number and had reached out to her outside of the club. And around that same time, Catherine had actually gotten Roof IED during one of her strip club shifts. A Roof IE is called the day-trape drug, basically makes you incapacitated and effectively unconscious. You don't remember anything. People will be given a Roof IE and then be sexually assaulted. That's often its use. And even though he'd never been able to prove this, Paul always suspected it had been Joe who gave Catherine that roofie. Catherine had cut off contact with Joe, but the whole incident had bothered Paul so much that he tried to convince Catherine to just quit the exotic dancing scene, but she refused. Paul admitted that he actually went on to call Catherine's father to tell him how worried he was about her, and Catherine had been so mad about that she stopped talking to Paul for weeks. And so Getz jotted all this down and then asked Paul if he knew how to get in touch with this guy Joe. Paul said he didn't have Joe's number, but it was definitely in Catherine's phone. Because the last time Paul ever spoke on the phone with Catherine, on the afternoon of her death, she had mentioned something that really surprised him. She said that after months of silence, Joe had started calling her again completely out of the blue. And at this, Getz studied Paul's face, looking for any hint of deception. This whole Joe story seemed like it might just be a way to deflect suspicion from Paul himself, but it really didn't feel like Paul was lying here, right, Paul? And besides, Catherine's phone records would be simple enough to verify. Getz hated to admit it, but maybe the newspapers were right. Maybe it was time he started looking seriously into some of Catherine's customers at the strip club. The following afternoon, on Wednesday, November 30th, Detective Getz was feeling really annoyed as he hung up the phone at his desk. It had been a call from another reporter, but Getz hadn't made an arrest yet, so he was staying tight-lipped. But for now, he just turned his focus back to the stack of papers on his desk. They were Catherine's cell phone records, which he'd subpoenaed yesterday, and they showed that Paul had been telling the truth. Both he and Joe had called Catherine shortly before she died. So he brought in Joe for an interview, and he asked him to explain why, after months of silence, he had called Catherine right before she turned up dead. And Joe had replied he'd only called her to check in, to say he hoped she had a nice Thanksgiving. He claimed that he was really just trying to be friendly. But then Getz just asked Joe point blank if he had ever roofied anyone's drink before. And at this, Joe's eyes went wide and he kind of sputtered out that he would never dream of doing anything like that. But based on Joe's tone, Getz really felt like he was lying. And so now, Getz felt like the entire investigation was wide open. A few days ago, he had been absolutely confident that David was the killer, but men from Catherine's life just kept coming out of the woodwork. He now had 3 main suspects instead of just one. In fact, at this point, his original suspect, David, was actually looking more innocent. Getz's officers had spoken to David's co-workers at the hotel where he worked as a doorman, and they confirmed that he really had stopped and talked to them on the evening of Catherine's death, just like he had claimed. And while Getz had hoped that the security camera footage from the apartment building would prove David was lying about his alibi, at least in terms of when he was there, it actually showed David leaving the front entrance of the building at 6:38 p.m., which lined up with David's story, because he said he left around 6:40. Now, this did not prove that David was innocent. Based on what the neighbors had heard, she could have been killed before 6:38. But there weren't a lot of cameras in the apartment building, and no angle covered the hallway outside of apartment D. So the footage couldn't prove one way or another, whether Brad Stewart or anybody else for that matter had gone into the apartment while David was gone. Just then his phone rang. Getz reached for it, expecting it to be another reporter, but this time he was pleasantly surprised. It was a member of the forensics team, and there was this obvious excitement in their voice. He told Getz that they just discovered something big, something they completely missed during their first sweep of Catherine's apartment. The forensic team member explained that when they'd first entered Catherine's bedroom, they had taken that mattress that was stuck behind the door and propped it up against the wall to get it out of the way. But when they'd done that, the mattress had actually covered up something that was right there on the wall all along, a bloody handprint. It was not until a couple of days later, after they had carefully gone over everything else in the room, that they moved the mattress back down onto the floor. And that's when they found the handprint. Getz's face lit up when he heard this news, because now he knew all he had to do was go get handprints from all of his suspects, which seemed like that would be pretty easy to do. But he quickly realized he had a problem, because some of his suspects had already lawyered up at this point. They were refusing to speak with police, let alone hand over their prints. And Getz really could not force them to give their prints unless he arrested them. And so that meant Getz was now in this weird catch-22, because he needed the suspect's prints in order to make the arrest. But he also couldn't get their prints unless he arrested them. So at this point, the investigation kind of stalled out. Weeks went by, and Detective gets started to get really frustrated because there was just nothing he could legally do to push the case forward. However, the case was still receiving a ton of coverage in the press and to a lot of people. It looked like the NYPD was just sort of dropping the ball. But then on December, so 3 weeks after Catherine's murder, the news coverage that had annoyed Gets so much actually ended up giving him exactly what he needed. That day, a woman called the NYPD because of something she had seen on the front page of one of the newspapers in New York. And what this woman said leads directly to Catherine's killer. Based on forensic evidence and numerous interviews, this is what police believe happened to Catherine Woods on the evening of November 27, 2005. Shortly after 6:40 p.m., the killer climbed the stairs inside of Catherine's apartment building. They knew that at that very moment, she'd be getting ready for another shift at Flash Dancers. And the fact that she even worked there secretly really bothered the killer way more than they would ever let on. The idea of Catherine dancing and giving her attention to other men made the killer so jealous, they couldn't even stand it. Now, the killer had tried to talk with Catherine and win her over, but she had rejected him. So the time for talking was over. And so the killer quietly walked up to the door of apartment D and reached down and turned the handle, which was unlocked. As they slipped silently into the apartment, the killer brought out the knife that they had hidden inside of their sweatshirt. But then something they had not anticipated happened. There was this dog lying on the apartment floor that got up and began to bark at them. For a moment, the killer thought about just abandoning the plan and leaving, but then Catherine, alerted by the dog, came out of the bedroom and looked right at the killer and saw the knife in their hand. Catherine screamed and ran right back into her bedroom, the very bedroom that she had made explicitly off-limits to the killer. And just thinking about that, a surge of anger suddenly overtook them, and the killer charged into the room after her. Catherine was already on the other side of the bed, lifting up the mattress as a sort of barricade, but the killer just forced their way past it and they grabbed Catherine from behind. But Catherine, she fought back. She began thrashing around, doing everything she could to break free, but she couldn't. And so they struggled and began smashing into the furniture and knocking things down all over the room. And it was around this point that the killer lifted up that knife they had brought and they slit her neck as deep as they could. But even then, even with this fatal wound, Catherine kept on fighting. And she was so vicious that the killer actually had to brace themselves against a wall just to keep their balance. And in the chaos, the killer didn't realize, as they're fighting off Catherine, that they had placed a bloody hand on the wall, leaving a print behind. Finally, when Catherine fell to the floor, the killer was still blinded with their rage and they just got down there and began stabbing her over and over again. And then finally, when Catherine stopped moving, the killer just jumped up and ran out of the apartment. But when they got into the hallway, they realized that Black Dog that had barked at them had gotten out. Now, the killer wanted the dog back in the apartment, but the dog was clearly on edge, They were still barking at the killer, and so instead, the killer just shut the apartment door, trapping the dog in the hallway. And then the killer fled the apartment building out the back door where there was no security camera. And for weeks the killer was not caught, until their violent past came back to bite them. Several weeks after Catherine's murder, a young woman who didn't know Catherine was walking down the streets of New York when she noticed a newspaper. And on the cover of this newspaper was plastered the face of the killer who is currently a suspect in a murder case. And this woman was horrified because she knew this person. Nay, the killer had sexually assaulted her about a year earlier, but she had never filed a police report. But after seeing that this horrible person was being actively accused of murder, she called the NYPD and she told them what she knew. And the NYPD Special Victims Unit used this woman's accusation as the basis to arrest the killer. And finally, once they were under arrest, Gitz was able to get their handprint. And those prints did in fact match the bloody handprint found on Catherine's wall. They belonged to Catherine's off-again boyfriend, Paul Cortez. David's suspicions of Paul had been right all along. Paul was a creep who had assaulted at least one other woman before he killed Catherine. Data collected from nearby cell towers would prove that Paul was near Catherine's apartment building immediately before her murder, and he had been calling her over and over again. When she ignored his calls, Paul waited until he saw David leave the apartment to go get his car, and then he hustled upstairs to the apartment knowing Catherine would be alone. Even though David was only gone for 20 minutes, that was still long enough for Paul to get inside the apartment, murder Catherine, and slip away unnoticed. Paul was arrested about a month after Catherine's murder on Wednesday, December 23, 2005. He was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events. But we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Ellen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Z.E.H. Lunding. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Aye. Audio editing and post-produced by Whitlock Asio and Colock Asio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Still. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Cade. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manat and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Cluxton Keener. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden.